Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prague. Today we're going to be reviewing the album Rajaz by the band Camel.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
I've said this in the past when I reviewed Nude by Camel, and I'll say it again. I do believe that this band is probably the biggest underdog of prog. They are well known within the prog community, but outside of it, no one really knows about them, and honestly a lot more people should know about them because they only have good and up albums. But yeah, that's just my personal opinion. Anyway, here are some of my favorite bits from this album. So my love for Camel began in 2016. I actually distinctly remember being in Germany that year and seeing the album cover for Mirage in a vinyl records shop and asking a friend of mine who also likes prog whether I should buy this one, and he told me it's a very good album, but I don't know if you'll like it, so I'd reckon not to buy it quite yet. And of course on the flight back home back then, I listened to that album, I fell in love with it, and I basically started listening to Mirage over and over and over, and then of course I got to know their other albums such as Moon Madness and even The Snow Goose. Now as time went by and I started listening to many of the, let's call them, mainstream contemporary prog bands, I started realizing that their 70s material was coming in and out of interest for me, and I wanted to explore new things, and a lot of that meant exploring late 70s and even 80s works by these bands. And trying music from the 80s and late 70s of these various bands proved very much different and ambiguous in many different ways, with albums such as Drama by Yes or Discipline by King Crimson being overall favorable with me, but albums like Pink Floyd's The Final Cut or Rush's Moving Pictures kinda didn't really go with what I wanted to listen to. So when it basically came time for me to explore more of Camel's discography, and by this point I've explored their previous works, their earlier works, I knew that I had to get into some later ones. So I started off small and I began with 1978's Breathless, and contrary to popular opinion, I love that album. I love it so much I have a copy of it on vinyl, and I don't really have that many albums on vinyl, but I really love every single thing about it. And then, you know what, I decided to go even further and I checked out 1984 Stationary Traveler, and I was blown away. I love this band and I love what they do, even if it's not coming out of the 70s. And this year was basically not a surprise. When I reviewed Nude, which came out in 1981, I also really liked that album, and despite it not being anywhere close to their opuses, I still do believe that it's a great album and it was a great listen. So coming into today's album, I really didn't know what to think because it was going yet another decade into the future, going just before the 2000s. This album today called Rajaz came out in 1999, and I honestly didn't know what to expect. So obviously what I did is that I did some research about it beforehand, and I've seen a popular opinion said by many that this is probably their strongest album coming out of them since their 70s run. The reasoning many people had behind this was that the band found their energies again, and they had all the liveliness that they had back in the 70s put into this album, which was definitely a surprise. And there's no real way I can say this other than I was really hyped for this one. But me knowing myself, I knew that I didn't have to get overly hyped, because when I do that I sometimes get overly disappointed as a result. So not being too naive, I lowered my expectations of this one, and I'm glad I did. So I'll preface this beforehand. This today's album, it's not a bad album, but definitely not the album I expected from the fan-made packaging that it received from all the reviews I read about it. It is a good album nonetheless, and it is quite reminiscent of what I'd expect out of Andrew Latimer's Camel, without of course Peter Brandis by his side, but as a whole I don't think that this one is as special as people made it out to be. And everyone knows Camel for their quintessential lineup back in the 70s and their wondrous tales and fantastical stories told in their albums in such an inspiring and moving way. They knew how to pass the narrative through in a great progressive manner, and I really love that. But this new incarnation of Camel, of course led by Andrew Latimer, is a much more mature and slower and calmer type of Camel, which we've already seen with his first album as the leader of the band, which was Nude, which was for the most part a very calm album, but it still had some reminiscent to the past with the big bombastic moments. But I do believe that today's album just shows of a very mature type of musical writing and compositions, which is not a bad thing, just really not what I was expecting. Now, after a long while of not doing so, this is the first Camel album, as I said, in a long while to not feature any story being told or any narrative. Rajaz contains various songs within it, which all are tied by one thing, which is probably the sandy Arabian influences, but it doesn't go ahead and try and tell you some sort of narrative. And honestly, in some really odd way, I just happened to think about it and I can't really stop thinking about it now. I do believe that a name Mirage would fit this album perfectly, way better than it fits their 1970s release, but of course it was already taken and thus it doesn't really work, and Rajaz is also a good name, but heck, I do feel like Mirage is the perfect name for this one. Now, this album being made of course by Camel, which is a band that I praise and cherish for probably the rest of eternity by this point, I was very attentive to the music on here and I really listened carefully to it, wanted to absorb everything that it had to do with anything, but the more attentive I got, the more I kind of just became more critical of this album, and not in the best way, unfortunately. So frankly, in hindsight, I think what I would tell myself for listening to this album the next time is just take a chill pill, lay back, listen to this one, let myself embrace the music, and in favor let the music embrace me, and I'm sure that the experience would just end up being way more wholesome. But unfortunately, I ended up being overly critical about this album, and well, my reception of it was pretty much in line with that, and I can say that I was pretty much disappointed by this album, and that's pretty much unfortunate. I don't think that this is a great album that I just personally don't like so much subjectively. I just believe that this album isn't really as great as many people make it out to be, and honestly, I've met people and I've talked to people who said that this is their favorite Camel album of all time, and I really don't know why, but I guess each man to his own. But on a more positive note, some of the tracks that I really liked from this one had to be the third track on this album, called The Final Anchor. It's a really good track, but unfortunately it just lacks by being too long in the end. I do think that if it was cut shorter, I would have liked it even much better. And I was also very much anticipating the title track of Rajaz on here, by that point basically experiencing full Arabian influences going all out, and then I was shocked when what I was faced with this song was actually a very interesting combination of an acoustic guitar and a cello. I don't know what to make of this. This was definitively the most interesting choice that the band made on this entire album, and you know what? I'm just kind of digging it. Unfortunately, my favorite track from this album is really a favorite of mine, and I really like that, and it's not just me marking the V in order to have one favorite from this album. My favorite from this one is actually the track called Sahara, which despite having a bit of an arduous build-up at the beginning is totally paying off at the end, making me want to listen to it again and again, and that's always a good thing. And this album also closes up with a track called Lawrence, which I do believe is a very nice homage, of course, to Thomas Edward Lawrence, who's also better much known as Lawrence of Arabia, the British colonel who strategized many of the fights in the Arabian revolts of the First World War, which made great advances in liberating the Middle East from the Ottoman Empire. And of course, many of us know him from the old-timer Hollywood blockbuster being Lawrence of Arabia as well. So while Andrew Latimer, Ton Sherpenzil, Colin Bass, and Dave Stewart tried tapping into the past of Camel, I do believe that their efforts were not quite met in the same way they probably wanted them to be. But again, I don't think that this is really what they wanted to try. I do believe that the sound of Camel on here is a mature sound, it's different, and they relish in that, and that's good. And from seeing many people writing about how they performed this one live, it seems like they found their adolescence yet again and found new energies to perform this one, and you know what, I couldn't be happier for them. So I state this one time and time again, but a good cover makes for a good album no matter what. If you don't think that an album is good but it has good cover, well, there's a good reason that you check the album beforehand just because of the cover art for it. And this of course all relates to today's cover, which I believe represents this album greatly and makes for a great reason for why people come and listen to this one in the first. Looking at this one, this smells of nostalgia. It has been 7 albums and 21 years since Camel actually had a camel on one of their covers, and I just love the fact that they decided to bring this motif back. It looks good, it is reminiscent of the past, and it's what every Camel fan probably wanted by this point, and they've definitely delivered. While I do believe that this cover is sort of mixed and matched with the reception of this album as well, people calling this one very much akin to their 70s works, while it really probably isn't, I think that the cover makes for a great reasoning for why this one feels so much in tune with the past. So while I didn't know this album's music up until now, this cover is one that I've known of for a long while now, and if I wasn't aware of this, I would have immediately guessed that this cover belonged to their all-time greatest run back in the 70s and definitely not a 1999 album. But unfortunately, this album really didn't do that much for me. I do believe that it was pretty much a lackluster, and in accordance with all that, it's gonna get a very lacking rating of 6 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're gonna be listening to Symbolic by Death. I don't know how many viewers of this channel really like this type of album, how many of you even know it, but it's a very known album, just not what we usually review on here. Anyway, yeah, I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon. Thank you so much to Clay Wanham, Risted Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best. And if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description. Oops, wrong hand. Down in the description or in my About page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.